When you think of Chicago in the 1920s, a few things probably come to mind. Prohibition, Al Capone and the Mafia. During Prohibition, Chicago was a hotbed of Mafia activity. Al Capone was the most notorious gangster in the city, and he controlled much of the illegal liquor trade. Countless movies, TV shows, and books have romanticized this time of greed, corruption, and fedora-clad killers. But even the most gritty Hollywood producers can't touch the aura of shock and horror that gripped the Windy City on February the 14th, 1929. The scene discovered in a Lincoln Park garage that day would become known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre and remains one of the grisliest unsolved mystery in Mafia history. Chicago was already riddled with small-time criminals before the 1920s. Prohibition simply paved the way for more intelligent, ruthless and organized gangs to emerge. And it was in this era of dry America that men like Al Capone capitalized on the illegal alcohol market, organized extensive networks of criminals, and fought for territorial rights with other crime syndicates. Despite being just 30 years old at the time of the massacre, Capone was not new to the organized crime game. He'd been active in Johnny Torrio's notorious New York street gang since dropping out of school after the 6th grade. In 1920, Capone followed Torrio to Chicago, where the two took advantage of the growth industries spawned by Prohibition, while simultaneously building legitimate businesses and cultivating influence with public officials, labor unions, and employee associations. Just 5 years later, Capone was the boss, controlling Chicago's Italian South Side and leading an underground network of smugglers that extended to Canada, all the while enjoying political and law enforcement protection. His penchant for custom suits, cigars and bombing speakeasies that refused to purchase liquor from him while simultaneously making large donations to charities made him a household name, a man who could walk into a room and evoke both fear and admiration. Capone was also a significant problem for other gangsters looking to turn a profit in the Chicago area. The territory each gang controlled was key to its power, influence and profit, and so the battle to gain more was never ending. While Capone's grip on the South Side was undebatable, the Irish North Side gang had a monopoly on the local supply of real beer and high-quality whiskey. The gang refused to sell portions of their North Side distilleries to the South Siders, ratcheting up tension between the groups that culminated in an assassination attempt on Capone in 1926. North Sider George Bugs Moran and his men showered a hotel where Capone was eating with more than 1,000 bullets. Miraculously, Capone emerged unharmed, but with a bitter resolve to execute revenge. Bugs Moran wasn't an easy man to take down. Like Capone, he had been involved in organized crime since he was a teen and had been jailed 3 times before his 21st birthday. He fled to Chicago and found his home with the North Side Gang, an established criminal organization with strong ties to the Chicago police. Moran despised Capone so openly that most of Chicago knew of his hatred. As a Catholic, he was disgusted by the prostitution ring that supplemented the South Side's criminal purse. Moran was also a devoted ally to North Side leader Hymie Weiss, who was killed in retaliation for the attempt on Capone's life. The bitter contempt between Moran and Capone was palpable. Such was the state of the Chicago mob turf war on February the 14th, 1929, as Moran's men arrived at the SMC Cartage Company garage on Clark Street. The dimly lit garage was used for storage and repairs, and was also the proposed rendezvous point for a truckload of bargain-priced whiskey. 7 men, all dressed in suits and ties with the exception of a mechanic in coveralls, entered the garage. Johnny May, a former safe blower hired by Moran as an auto mechanic. The Gusenberg brothers, Frank and Peter, 2 of the city's most troublesome goons. James Clark, real name Albert Kachelik, a convicted armed robber and a reputed killer. Adam Heyer, aka Frank Snyder, an accountant and embezzler. Albert Weinshank, a nightclub owner and a newly appointed official of the Central Cleaners and Dyers Association. And an optometrist named Reinhard H. Schwimmer, who hung around the Moran gang to gamble and rub elbows with the dangerous crowd. The men were waiting on Bugs, who was running late when a black Cadillac stopped in front of the garage. Neighbours watched as 4 or 5 men got out, one wearing a chinchilla topcoat and grey fedora, another 2 in police uniforms. Minutes later, popping noises began to ring out. A backfiring engine, the neighbours thought. The men re-emerged, drove away, and the streets fell silent. A man who lived nearby walked over and pushed open the door to the garage. The floor was covered in mutilated bodies. Dark blood covered the concrete floor and slipped into a drain. As the neighbour looked on in shock, they heard someone gasping for air. One of the men was still alive. That man was Frank Gusenberg. He'd been shot 14 times but was still clinging to life as police arrived on the scene. He was taken to hospital where detectives desperately questioned him. But Gusenberg abided by the mob's code of silence until the very end, refusing to name the killers who had lined up and murdered his brother and friends in his final hours of life, stating, "No one shot me," before dying hours later. Despite Gusenberg's silence, most believed the perpetrator was obvious: Al Capone. The North Siders and South Siders feud was a poorly kept secret, and Moran was supposed to be at the garage that morning. He had shown up, in fact, just after the murders, but scampered away when he saw the police cars, suspecting his garage was being raided. Capone, too, was absent from the crime scene that centered around the 2 mobsters. He sat over 1,000 miles away in a Dade County, Florida courthouse, awaiting an interview with a prosecutor investigating a different murder. By the time he emerged from the meeting, news of the massacre had spread coast to coast. In Chicago, papers ran photos from the murder scene that turned the city's collective stomach. Even in black and white, the images conveyed how deeply the city had spiraled into evil. Citizens and law enforcement alike were desperate for an arrest. Capone's alibi was airtight, but it didn't matter. Public resentment over the mob had reached boiling point, and other suspects were scant. There was little evidence aside from the bodies and vague descriptions from witnesses. Theories arose and were quickly discarded. Perhaps it was the work of the police. After all, 2 of the killers were dressed in uniform. Unsurprisingly, law enforcement promptly discarded that theory. Some believed Moran himself could be responsible. Maybe the men had been insubordinate or crossed him. But even though Moran escaped the massacre with his life, his career was finished, and his gang never recovered. A man whose team can be wiped out without so much as a fight is not a man who can command fear any longer. Another theory eyed the Detroit-based Purple Gang, which was supposedly the outfit the whiskey shipment was coming from that day. There were theories about politicians, other mobsters, and angry business partners. But nothing seemed to add up. Moran's men hadn't as much as pulled a gun, and their bodies were untouched. Thousands of dollars were found in their pockets. Police were no closer to the truth a month later when Herbert Hoover was sworn in as the 31st President of the United States, and eager to make a grand gesture that fulfilled his promise to combat organized crime. He wanted Capone, and he pressured prosecutors to find a way to take him down no matter the evidence. In December of 1929, a well-known bank robber named Fred Burke was found with a small arsenal of weapons, including 2 machine guns used in the St. Valentine's Day massacre. But he was never charged with the crime, and any questioning police may have done was never made public. Burke died in prison while serving a sentence for a different murder. Why wouldn't police jump on this easy suspect? Why not pursue justice with a man who held the murder weapons? Were they trying to keep the focus on Capone? Nothing brought us closer to an answer until 1935, when another bank robber named Byron Bolton told the feds he knew who committed the St. Valentine's Day massacre. He named Burke and 4 other men and claimed he was the lookout for the job. He said he gave the signal when he saw Albert Weinshank and mistook him for Moran. Bolton's statements were backed up by the widow of a perpetrator named by Bolton and William Drury, a Chicago detective. But by the time Bolton made his supposed confession, all but 2 of the men he named were dead. Another had an alibi. There was little interest in pursuing the lead when Hoover had already achieved what he wanted. In 1931, Capone was convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in prison. The most notorious gangster in America was off the streets. Prohibition had been repealed, and the Southsiders of Chicago had slipped back to the slimy underbelly of the city in a web of prostitution, gambling, and racketeering. The St. Valentine's Day massacre is still unsolved, and Moran's garage on Clark Street was demolished in 1967 to make way for a parking lot. The brick wall where the execution took place was purchased by a Canadian businessman and displayed in various crime-related novelty displays before most of the bricks were bought by the Mob Museum in Las Vegas, where visitors can still see them today. But perhaps the most significant remnant of the massacre is not in Vegas, nor even Chicago, but at the FBI archives in Washington, D.C. A letter containing the cramped, tidy script of a Chicago man named Frank T. Farrell could hold the truth behind the St. Valentine's Day massacre. Though ignored by police, Byron Bolton's claims were widely published by the media, and Frank Farrell, an undercover investigator, took notice. After reading Bolton's version of events, he penned a letter to John Edgar Hoover dated January 28, 1935. The letter outlined Farrell's personal theory about the massacre. William Davin Jr., son of a Chicago police sergeant, had been shot during a bar fight in November 1928 at the C&O restaurant, a popular gangster hangout. As Davin Jr. lay dying in the hospital, he confided in his cousin, William White, that he had been shot by some members of Moran's gang, including one of the Gusenberg brothers. William White had another name in Chicago, Three-Fingered Jack, and he was one of the city's most notorious criminals with a reputation for brutality. According to Farrell's letter, White decided to avenge his cousin and had an easy way to do so. White and the Gusenbergs had allegedly worked together on a 1926 robbery along with several other men. When one of their accomplices began ratting them out to the cops, White sent 2 men disguised as cops to the rat's home, where they murdered him. Farrell alleges that White contacted the Gusenbergs and suggested they hit another factory. The Gusenbergs enlisted Moran's gang to help, and they arranged a meeting at the garage on Clark Street to hammer out the details. Farrell's theory resolves many of the mysteries surrounding the St. Valentine's Day massacre. It explains why so many of Moran's men were at the garage that morning, dressed for a business meeting. It explains why they didn't fire their guns at the intruders, and explains why 2 of the perpetrators were wearing police uniforms. White knew they put witnesses at ease and allowed killers to flee without haste or notice. He also had an easy access to them, and it provides a clear motive with enough emotional power to explain the sheer depravity of the massacre. It may even explain why the investigation went nowhere. Perhaps the police department knew the murders were committed in retaliation for the slaying of a child of one of their own, and because White went on to be a federal informant and supplied the FBI with dirt on Chicago's worst criminals in exchange for protection. It's possible that J. Edgar Hoover knew the truth himself and buried it in the archives along with Farrell's letter. But which theory do you believe to be true? Any of the ones mentioned, or perhaps you have an entirely different take? Let us know in the comments below. Oh, And if you'd like to help support the show and gain access to a few bonus episodes, consider becoming a channel member. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, well, I never.